Chapter 341. Talent and Defiance. Michael was ridiculously strong. Juliana had known this. She had seen him fight during the massacre. She herself had fought him during the entrance exam. She had heard of what he did to Samael and his gang back on the final day of high school. Not only was he blessed with a battle IQ that nearly rivaled Samael's own, he was also naturally versed in hand-to-hand combat and swordsmanship. Yes, it was clear he had learned a thing or two from somewhere, or someone, but his inborn talent was undeniable. Talent. That was a word Juliana had a very close relationship with. She was not modest enough to pretend she wasn't talented. She was talented. That was also undeniable. Aside from perhaps 2 or 3 cadets back at the academy, no one her age could best her in swordplay. She also knew she was highly intelligent, and just crazy enough to use whatever tactic necessary in order to win. But was that enough? Was her talent enough here? After spending so much time traveling with this group, Juliana had realized something. These people were elites among the elites. Lily was a strategic genius, and not just because of her origin card. Sure, her powers amped her inherent intelligence for controlling the flow of the battle, but Juliana had no doubt she'd be just as useful without it. Why would she think that? Because merely seeing 4 to 5 seconds into the future was not enough to prevent it on its own. Lily needed to have a deep understanding of not only everyone's powers, but also their personalities, fighting styles, and position preferences. She needed to know how to use everyone best, how to utilize the group to its full potential. Her call-outs were always the difference between life and death for them, but Juliana knew Lily also had to account for how to best proceed after avoiding a fatal scenario. In the worst case, she also had to account for failures. As a self-proclaimed strategist herself, Juliana knew this was no easy task. Thankfully, her allies were just as much of geniuses as her. Alexia needs no praise. The girl had literally fought a demonic rank creature alone, not only holding her own but pushing him back. Okay, sure, the creature was weakened as hell, but it still counts. And yeah, Juliana had done it too, so she knew it wasn't as easy as Alexia made it look. For a small and harmless-looking, doll-like beauty, that young woman was a goddess of close-quarters combat. The only reason she was injured against Vhagar was because Ray was going down and Lily was out of the equation. And speaking of Ray, he was probably one of the best mid to long-range fighters she'd seen at their rank. He was capable enough to both create openings for others or exploit them himself if need be by speed blitzing his opponent. In that way, she guessed, his role was very similar to hers. Then there was Kong. While an excellent scout by trade, he was usually the one fearlessly diving in after Ray and her. Since he held the mid-line and supported the frontline fighters just like her, Juliana had observed him fight up close. The boy was a feral beast, quite literally. But if she was most surprised by someone, it would have to be the unsung hero of their party. The one who didn't get enough recognition because he did his work in silence, always stayed low, and never complained. Vince cleverly. His origin card allowed him to drastically buff himself and his allies at the cost of being unable to use their powers after the battle for a certain amount of time. His arsenal was full of enhancement and buff cards, without even a single card focused on offense. Juliana had met him before. She knew he was the 3rd-ranked cadet back at the academy, though that was mostly because the rankings of the top 10 hadn't been shuffled much since the entrance exam. Still, such a high rank was a testament to his prowess. But when he had first revealed his arsenal, his choice of build had confused Juliana. Is this guy even going to be helpful at all? She remembered thinking. And oh boy, was she wrong. Vince, as it turned out, was a monster at making split-second decisions. By actively listening to Lily's calls and analyzing the ongoing battle, he majorly improved the team's execution by preempting the needs of his comrades before they even realized they were lacking. While Lily saw the danger coming, Vince was the one who ensured everyone was physically capable of reacting to it. He predicted the exact moment a frontline fighter like Ray would hit a stamina wall or when Kong would require an extra layer of durability to survive a hit. Unlike other supporters, he didn't waste essence on flashy spells or unnecessary shields. Instead, he waited for the precise millisecond of impact to layer a reinforcement card, or time to buff just as someone was about to pivot for a counterattack. It was a terrifying level of synergy. He was the oil in their perfectly tuned machine, turning Lily's strategic vision into tangible reality. Juliana realized then that while Michael and Samael were monsters of individual prowess, Vince was the ultimate force multiplier. But the funny thing is, most of the time, no one even noticed the extra support. Juliana understood the pain of hard work going unnoticed. She had saved many of these people more than once, but no one seemed to remember much of it once the rush of adrenaline faded. Well, whatever, she was going to get her use out of them one way or another. Anyway, the point is, she knew what it was like to be talented. But after being surrounded by such exceptional people, she also realized what it feels like to know you're not the only chosen one. It's a strange feeling when your talent is eclipsed by someone else's. It's a humiliating feeling, and for her, that was especially the case now, when she was being pushed back. Clang! Michael's dark longsword came down on her with the force of a sledgehammer. Juliana blocked by crossing her katana over her wakizashi, but was still flung several meters across the rocky ground. He didn't give her a moment to breathe. Like a man possessed, he closed the distance in a blur of motion, his armored footsteps heavy enough to crack the ground. He wasn't just optimizing his strength, he was weaponizing it. Every move he made and every cut he dealt was a masterpiece of refined violence. Where Juliana relied on grace and agility, Michael practiced a form of elevated swordsmanship that stripped away all flair in favor of pure, crushing efficiency. He was executing quick and precise swings, a barrage of mechanical slashes with no visible flaws at all. Skidding to a stop, she gritted her teeth, the vibration from the last impact still numbing her forearms. Juliana had spent her life honing her skills, convinced that she had what it took to surpass her mother, or even her paternal grandfather, the last sword saint of the West. No, not only that. She was actually arrogant enough to think she could maybe one day rival the current sword saint of the West, Prince Raigan V. Caliph. But against Michael, she felt like a rough draft being rectified by a master editor. He wasn't just fighting her so much as he was systematically dismantling the notion that she was ever special, that she was ever talented. Clang! Michael attacked again, invading her personal space. Juliana could see herself in his visor like it was a dark mirror reflecting her true self, weak. She didn't like what she saw. His sword, wrapped in layers upon layers of churning shadows, came down at her with enough force to shatter a boulder. She threw her katana up in response, catching his blade above her head before it split her skull open. Sparks flew, and just like before, she was shaken by the force of the impact, only now, she had managed to intercept his strike a fraction of a second faster. She was adapting. Yet it wasn't enough. Michael stomped his foot to push in, forcing Juliana to take a step back. She wasn't going to win in a contest of strength. It was evident when her knee nearly gave way under the weight. But before she could take a serious wound, Juliana slanted her sword at a sharp angle, letting his massive blade slide harmlessly off her steel with a metallic hiss. Screech! As his heavy blade bit into the stone floor where her head had been a millisecond prior, she didn't retreat. Instead, she stepped into his guard. Her wakizashi, the shorter, faster blade that she held in a reverse grip now, flickered toward the gap in his armpit from below his stretched-out sword hand. It was a strike meant to punish his crushing efficiency with utter opportunism. But Michael didn't panic. He didn't even shift his weight. He simply released the hilt of his longsword with one hand and caught her wrist in a grip that felt like a shackle of cold iron. Then he whirled around and hurled her toward a speeding Vince. She had to jump in time to not get sliced by Michael's sword, which meant she had to relinquish her footing and could offer no resistance when he tossed her away. In fact, she barely had time to register the sensation of her feet leaving the ground before Michael's centrifugal force turned her into a living projectile being launched at her own ally. Vince immediately activated a card to buff her so she wouldn't be too badly hurt when she crashed into the canyon wall, though he could tell it was still going to fracture a rib or two. Then he slid under her, never stopping his charge. Michael twirled the longsword in his grip and readied himself just before Ray came blasting in like a rocket and speared him from the side. The collision was a thunderous bang of kinetic energy. Ray, moving at a supersonic velocity that blurred the air into a shimmering heat haze, struck Michael's flank with the force of a battering ram. The shockwave from the impact rippled through the canyon, sending a cloud of pulverized stone and dust billowing into the air. Michael, despite his mountain-like stability, was finally uprooted. He skidded sideways across the rocky floor for several meters, his armored boots carving deep trenches as he fought to maintain his balance. Ray didn't let up. Upon realizing the spear tackle wasn't going to put him on the ground, he let go and assumed a fighting stance to engage in close combat, delivering a mean right hook before Michael had the chance to do anything about it. He followed up by detonating an explosion from his left palm to propel it forward with the speed of a rocket, hitting Michael's midsection at point blank with all that force. Ray still couldn't understand how this guy didn't double over. A deep gash above Ray's own forehead was bleeding, slightly blurring the vision of his right eye. He had taken a vicious hit a few minutes ago, leaving Juliana to engage with this monster alone. If not for his fast reflexes and Lily's warning cry, he'd have lost an eye, or worse. But that didn't stop him from joining the fray right back again. Meanwhile, Juliana hit the canyon wall with a bone-jarring thud. Thanks to Vince's last-second buff, the rock didn't shatter too many of her ribs. It just felt like slamming into a high-density foam mattress from a 2-story jump. She slid down the stone face, coughing out a cloud of grit, her vision spinning but her consciousness mercifully intact. Vince didn't even look back at her. He was already sliding to a halt near the center of the fight as he fanned out a new set of cards from his arsenal. "Ray, don't overextend," he shouted. Chapter 342, Talent and Defiance 2. Ray overextended. He was itching for this fight. For any fight, actually. Ever since he had watched Alexia take that brutal hit meant for him against Vagar, he couldn't sleep, he couldn't think, he couldn't even breathe in peace. That scene kept replaying in front of his eyes over and over and over again, driving him to lose his mind. He was frustrated. No, frustration couldn't even begin to cover the volatile cocktail of guilt and rage simmering in his gut. So, he decided to vent it all out right now. He detonated one explosion after another, using the concussive force to either propel his fists forward or snap his body out of the way, both at breakneck speeds. Moving in that blur of combustive motion, his punches were less like punches and more like guided missiles. Each blow that connected to Michael's matte black armor rang out with the percussive, bone-shaking force of a cannon blast. Yet, it wasn't enough. None of it was enough. Ray was a human dynamo, a whirlwind of fire and ash and unbridled force. But Michael tanked those hits without so much as a grunt of discomfort. His dark armor didn't show even a hairline crack under the assault. He wasn't budging an inch, standing like a monolith against the storm. So Ray decided to amp it up. He deployed a set of enhancement and movement buff cards before diving back in with a heavy straight. Michael was ready this time, though. He cemented his footing then raised a free hand. Ray's missile-like punch connected with Michael's vambrace. But instead of absorbing its full force, Michael slightly opened the face of his forearm and deflected the incoming strike away from him, letting Ray's forward momentum just slide off. It was a masterclass in redirection. By sloping his arm only a few degrees to the side, Michael turned Ray's explosive force into a liability before completely stepping out of the way. The guided missile didn't hit its mark this time. It grazed the target and kept going. Ray, unable to kill his own velocity in time, shot past Michael like a runaway train that had lost its rails, his balance momentarily lost. Michael didn't let him recover. With the efficiency of a slaughterhouse machine, he brought his shadowy longsword up high and then whipped it down toward the back of Ray's neck, intending to decapitate the boy in one clean stroke. Unfortunately for him, Lily had already alerted Ray of this exact scenario. So even though it looked like he was stumbling forward uncontrollably, it had actually been a high-stakes bait. Ray skewed his other arm and threw it back at an awkward angle without fully turning himself. Then, before the blade could fall on his nape like a guillotine, he blasted another fiery explosion. It worked as a kinetic shield and a counterattack all at once. The blast of superheated air and raw concussive energy slammed into the leading edge of Michael's shadow-wrapped longsword. Crack THWOOM. The sound was a distorted thunderclap that vibrated in their marrow. The force of the explosion was enough to disrupt the trajectory of Michael's blade, flicking it upward and away. The unnatural bend of Ray's arm when the explosion went off put a massive strain on his shoulder, so much so that it felt like the joint would dislocate under the pressure. Thankfully, it didn't. It still hurt like hell, but it was worth it. Because now there was a clear opening in Michael's stance. Ray didn't waste the heartbeat of hesitation he'd earned. Ignoring the white-hot agony in his shoulder, he used the recoil of the explosion to snap his body around like a high-tension torsion spring. As Michael's blade was thrown skyward by the blast, his midsection was left completely exposed. It was a rare lapse in his masterful fighting style. Ray drove his lead foot into the rocky floor and channeled a huge portion of his essence into his arm, reaching for Michael's solar plexus. But of course, Michael wasn't out of options yet. He couldn't bring his sword back down in time, so what? He could still use his legs. And that's exactly what he began to do. He started lifting his right foot, either to kick aside Ray's incoming hand or to plant a heavy boot squarely in the boy's chest to push him away. Either way, it was the wrong choice. Because this was exactly what they had been waiting for. Yes, they, swoo. Vince came barreling in from the periphery and wrapped himself around Michael's other, still planted leg, using his entire deadweight to throw the armored powerhouse off balance. Michael's eyes widened behind his visor. This was a problem. He couldn't afford to fall now, because the moment he hit the dirt, they would be all over him like wolves. As such, dealing with Vince became the immediate priority. Michael instinctively decided to brace for Ray's incoming attack, endure the pain, and use this moment to eliminate the blue-haired boy at his feet instead. But again, this was exactly what they'd been counting on. As Michael twirled the sword to point it downward and started thrusting it toward Vince, Ray's reaching hand changed direction and instead went to clasp Michael's wrist. By snatching the sword arm mid-thrust, Ray stalled the black blade mere inches from Vince's head. It took a lot of effort to hold back a juggernaut like Michael, but Ray had to struggle for only a moment. Because in the next one, he ignited another blazing explosion, right around Michael's seized arm. Kaboom! The point-blank blast was blinding, scorching, and deafening all at once. Vince's ears were ringing with a high-pitched whine that made him feel like he'd never hear anything ever again. But the one in absolute agony was Michael. His vambrace shattered, crushed into metallic, razor-sharp fragments that either flew off or bit deep into his own flesh under the full force of that superheated detonation. Michael threw his head back. The sound that escaped his helm was a mix of a roar and a desperate gasp, the first true sound of pain he had cried out in this fight. It broke Ray's heart to do that to the boy he had come to consider his friend. But it was a binary choice, either subdue him, or get killed by him. A broken arm could be fixed later. If they died in this canyon, though, there was no fixing that. So Ray gritted his teeth and pulled away his own bloody hand, scorched and raw, littered with dark metallic shrapnel piercing his palm. Michael's grip of his sword arm went slack. The weapon should have slipped from his grasp. But somehow, it didn't. Somehow, his fist still stayed closed around that shadowy longsword. He still refused to let go of the blade. So that's when Lily decided to jump in herself. Michael didn't even register her until she was right beside him, throwing one of her arms over his elbow and using the other to interlock it. Then she hopped, wrapping both her legs around his waist, essentially executing a standing variation of a Kimura lock. The submission hold was putting extreme, bone-creaking tension on his rotator cuff and elbow joint. With that, Michael was now truly compromised. One leg was anchored by Vince's deadweight, and his primary arm was being torn off by Lily. But still, he still wasn't yielding, he still wasn't falling. Some fucking how, Michael Godswill refused to go down. His back was arched, his muscles screaming under the combined strain of two people trying to break his frame, yet he stood like a rooted oak in a hurricane. He was an embodiment of sheer, stubborn willpower. But even he had to follow the laws of physics when Ray Warner's palm suddenly clamped down on his visor, and yet another devastating explosion was discharged right at his face. Kraboom. The sound of ceramic and metal cracking resounding across the canyon was drowned out by a raw, visceral scream ripping out of Michael's throat. His helmet came undone in fractured pieces, revealing the ashen eyes hiding behind. The left side of his face was burned and bleeding in spots, though the damage didn't look permanent. His resilience was terrifying. Even with his visor shattered and his face a map of fresh trauma, Michael's ghostly eyes didn't roll back into unconsciousness. But physics finally won the day. With his center of gravity shredded by Vince, his sword arm pinned by Lily's lock, and the concussive force of Ray's blast rattling his brain, Michael's knees finally buckled. He crashed back onto the ground, the heavy weight of his black armor creating a dull thud. He grunted out loud, and when he finally looked up, he once again saw Ray high in the air before the boy propelled himself down like a kinetic projectile. Michael couldn't even close his eyes before a brutal punch landed squarely on his nose. Thwack. Although it was a good hit, Ray didn't celebrate since he had already heard Lily's frantic warning when he was coming down. Unluckily, he was beelining so fast that he didn't have the chance to stop the descent. It was something he was going to regret very soon. Why? Because Michael, up until that point, hadn't once deployed his origin card. He did then. Using his innate power to copy Ray's, Michael created a condensed lance of explosive firepower in his good hand, and lashed it toward the side of Ray's ribs. Ray's body was still vertical like an arrow, his fist still connected to Michael's face, when the fiery lance exploded. Kaboom! The shockwave was a mirror image of Ray's own brutality, and it sent him spiraling through the air. He slammed into the rocky floor, skidding for meters before crashing into the canyon wall. And just like that, the tide of the battle shifted. Michael stood up. effortlessly lifting the complete weight of Lily up high, before snapping the leg around which Vince was wrapped like a whip. Vince didn't even realize he had let Michael's leg go until he was spinning end over end in the air, until his body plowed through the ledge and trees above and tumbled into the forest above the cliff walls. Lily, reading the situation, immediately tried to disengage, but Michael didn't give her the luxury. He swished down and body slammed the slender girl into the ground with enough force to send cracked spider webbing through the earth. Her breath was knocked out of her lungs as she saw stars. She was in no condition to move if Michael were to try to end her right here. Thankfully, before he could chain his attacks, a condensed light of explosive energy shot forward, forcing Michael to lean away to dodge as the projectile slammed into a ridge behind him, erupting in a shower of stone and fire. It had come from Ray, who was trembling as he tried to push himself up against the rock. The left side of his torso was charred, his clothes reduced to smoldering rags. He was coughing blood, but he had still bought Lily a second of life. Michael could have retaliated, but he didn't. He had a bad feeling about staying in the open here. Juliana was somewhere nearby, but he couldn't see her. If she pitched in now, she could buy time for Ray to recover. So instead of targeting them, he pivoted and sprinted toward the near vertical cliff face, scaling it in two monstrous jumps that defied gravity. His armored fingers gouged deep into the stone as he crested the ledge and entered the forest. He was going to isolate Vince. He was going to take them out one by one. Chapter 343, Conviction of a Hero. The sky was so beautiful. Although he could only see small slivers of it through the dense, interlocking canopy that blocked the view, lying there on the forest floor atop a soft carpet of underbrush and rotting leaves. Vince had no doubt in his heart that the sky was, indeed, so beautiful. That particular crimson shade of the atmosphere reminded him of his little sister. It was her favorite color. Or it had been, at least, back when he actually knew her. He didn't know anything anymore. Agqua. A few broken coughs scraped out of his parched throat, tasting of dust. His limbs were numb, his left ankle was bent at an angle that hurt like hell, his right hand was twisted painfully beneath his weight, and his back was sharply throbbing in spots that felt like daggers to his flesh. He was genuinely surprised he hadn't broken every single bone in his body. Or perhaps he had, and the shock was simply too much for him to notice the full damage yet. He tried to shift, but gave up instantly with a pathetic sob. Okay, something was definitely broken. Not wasting another second, he fumbled into his quick-access pocket and fished out a couple of cards, equipping them into his soul arsenal. A moment later, they were drawn and activated. Some of them numbed the rending pain like anesthesia, while others gave him a frantic surge of artificial strength so he could valiantly grit through the agony and stand back up. And stand back up he did. Even though every single vertebra in his spine protested the motion, even though every drop of blood in his veins felt like coursing liquid fire, he pushed himself upright. Leaning heavily against the gnarled, moss-slicked trunk of a tree nearby that stood taller than a watchtower, he took a few deep breaths. For whatever reason, this situation reminded him of his little brother. His memory hit Vince harder than Michael's kick. He could almost see that little gremlin bouncing on the edge of the sofa, eyes wide and reflecting the glow of the TV screen. That boy used to love those cliché stories where the righteous hero was senselessly beaten into the dirt, bruised and bloody, only to find some hidden reservoir of determination, or realize the power of friendship, and rise for one last round. Back then, Vince used to roll his eyes at his little brother's naive excitement. Now, he couldn't help but choke on a dry laugh. Suddenly, a rustling and the sharp snap of twigs from the large ferns up ahead drew his gaze. An imposing figure, clad in battered dark armor, emerged from the greenery. Michael's busted arm was hanging uselessly at his side, so he now gripped his shadowy longsword with a white-knuckled intensity in his other hand. The flesh on the left side of his face was still scorched and bleeding in patches, but his ashen eyes held a menacing glint as they locked onto their target. But that target didn't care. Vince cleverly kept looking up at the sky. I wonder what they're doing right now, he sighed, finally dispatching his origin card as Michael began taking deliberate steps toward him. I wonder if they're happy. They were the last time I saw them. That memory was the ghost that haunted him every waking hour. He wished he could go back and muster enough courage to confess he was not a stranger, confess that he was their one and only elder brother. He wished he hadn't been such a coward. He wished he hadn't run away. Drip. A single tear streamed down his face, then another, then another, then another. Drip, drip, drip. They traced salty paths through the grime on his cheeks before falling into the dirt. After a second, once Michael was within striking distance, Vince wiped his eyes with a blood-smeared sleeve. He didn't look anything like those righteous heroes from his brother's favorite movies, not with his tattered clothes and shaky knees. He wondered if those heroes ever felt as terrified as he did right now, or if they were just better at hiding the fear, like he was trying to be. He smiled. It was a toothy, defiant smile. What did it matter? Whether they were scared or not, they pushed through and fought. He would have to do the same. In that regard, how was a hero's conviction any different from someone like him? He finally lowered his gaze to meet the dark figure of the young man who looked like an evil villain of an ill-fated fairy tale. "I'm not going to die," Vince declared, lifting his arms to assume a shuddering fighting stance just as Michael raised his blade and prepared to charge. "I'll go back, and I'll have my happy ending. I'll take my happy ending." Michael blurred, appearing in front of the blue-haired boy before Vince's brain could even register the displacement of air. But Vince had already played his final trump card. In that exact moment, he had made a self-imposed vow to not use his innate power for the remainder of this entire journey. Meaning he would not call upon his origin card as long as he was going to be in the Noctvale Wilds, be it 10 days or a month or forever. It was an indefinite pact. And it was the strongest pact he could have possibly made. Why? Well, to understand that, you'd have to first understand how Vince's vows worked. They weren't just magic words or empty promises that you could just utter and get a power-up. You had to sacrifice something proportional to gain something in return. As such, the more unfair a pact was to you, the bigger a power-up you'd gain. For example, if Vince was at home, safe and sound, giving up his power for days would still grant him only a negligible boost because he wasn't truly risking anything. But in a literal death zone, taking an oath to remain powerless for even a few hours would give him a drastic buff. So in a place like that, where his life was forever in danger, he'd chosen to shed his main weapon for as long as he was there. The conditions of the pact were everything. And just now, Vince had gambled his entire survival, for just 10 seconds of unparalleled dominance. Yeah, on top of vowing to not use his powers in the Noctvale Wilds until he'd leave, he had also put a time limit on himself. A time limit of 10 mere seconds. The pact wasn't just unfair, it was overwhelmingly unreasonable. Michael's shadowy blade was already mid-swing, inching toward Vince's neck at a speed that would have been utterly incomprehensible to any C-ranker. Yet, Vince reacted. That was because the fundamental gap between a C rank and a B rank wasn't just their physique, albeit their physique was definitely enhanced as well, it was the mastery of essence. It was only because of reinforcing their bodies with essence that B rankers were capable of tanking hits strong enough to split entire boulders and move at the speed of sound. A C ranker, even with a circulation technique, couldn't match that because they couldn't truly feel the world on the level of their ascended counterparts. They couldn't feel essence. But right now, due to the pact Vince had made, his body was performing at such a transcendent level that it instinctively began to feel and manipulate essence without the need for a circulation technique at all. In simple words, for the duration of these 10 seconds, Vince cleverly was physically on par with an actual B rank in every physical aspect save for the size of his essence reserve. The shadowy blade slowed to a crawl in his perception. He ducked under it and retaliated with a barrage of palm strikes into Michael's exposed chest. Thack. Chapter 344, Conviction of a Hero 2. Whether it was because Michael had taken some critical hits from Ray earlier, or maybe because he simply wasn't expecting Vince to move at that speed, the protagonist was left unable to react at all. In fact, he didn't even see the strike. He only felt it. 1 second Michael was about to decapitate an easy prey. The next, he stumbled back hard, his heavy boots carving deep furrows in the forest loam. The consecutive, bone-jarring impacts of the palm strikes shook his internal organs and nearly dented the matte black chest plate. Nearly 7 seconds left. Vince didn't allow him a moment to reset his center of gravity. He moved with a visceral speed, closing the distance before the echoes of his strikes could even reach the canopy. He wasn't delusional enough to think he was as strong as Michael, even with this 10-second pact. His whole attack plan was built on the element of surprise. Once that first attack connected, his strategy was to keep chaining the strikes non-stop. Because, so what if he wasn't strong? At least right now, he was the hero of his own cliché. And heroes don't lose. He seized Michael's wrist, the one holding that cursed longsword, and with a powerful snap, he yanked him downward. At the same time, he drove his knee upward into Michael's shattered visor. 6 seconds. The ridiculous amount of force behind that blow sent Michael's head thrashing back, his ashen eyes finally glazing over as his mind was overwhelmed by the sheer, irrational ferocity of Vince's assault. Rivulets of blood dropped down his nose, but he blinked himself back to focus, shaking off the possible concussion. 5 seconds. Vince felt the strain starting to settle over him. His physique was not yet suitable for handling essence. The overclocked pact was a double-edged sword, and the edge facing him was starting to bite. But it was fine, his work was almost done. He just needed to land one more strike on that chest plate to break it. Just one more. So he tried to stabilize his footing and reach for Michael's sternum while still holding the wrist, but the protagonist was ready this time. Michael used his tyrannical strength to wrestle for control of his sword hand. While he couldn't manage to free it entirely, he did loosen Vince's grasp enough to bring the edge of his longsword toward the blue-haired boy's chin. Thankfully, Vince was able to react in time by throwing himself aside. Even now, even in his desperation, he didn't let go of Michael's wrist. He knew that once that guy started freely using his cursed sword, there would be no fight after that. There would only be a slaughter of him. Vince crouched under Michael's hand and swiveled around, still maintaining the hold. Thwack! He was gaining enough momentum to execute a quick over-the-shoulder judo throw, but before he could fully get into position, a heavy foot stomped onto his back and sent him staggering. Vince swiftly fell into a roll and sprang back to his feet, though his vision swam. Under normal circumstances, Michael would have already utilized this opening. But just seconds before he could bring his foot down after that kick, a blurry silhouette jumped down on him from the towering trees above. While Ray was still struggling to catch himself, Lily Elderwing had moved on ahead, scaled the cliff, and arrived in the forest a few moments ago. She had been stalking for an opportunity to go in, and she got it just then. She dropped onto Michael from a tree branch overhead and wrapped her arms around his throat, squeezing tight to cut off his air. No matter how strong AB Ranker is, they can't fight if they can't breathe. Michael's boots skidded on the ground, his balance wavering against the sleeper hold. Grunting, he twisted his wrist, angling the shadowy longsword toward his own back to impale the girl clinging to him. Vince saw that movement and realized this was it. This was his chance to charge ahead. 4 seconds. Without a hint of hesitation, he traded the remainder of his 4 seconds for a single burst of speed and became a streak of smudge in the air. His fist was cocked back, aiming right for the center of Michael's armored sternum. Unfortunately, he was so focused on that last move that he didn't register the precognitive dread in Lily's eyes. He didn't hear her shrieking his name in warning. Or maybe he did, maybe he just didn't register it until… Kaboom! Michael didn't try to stab Lily anymore. Instead, he pointed the blade of his sword directly at the incoming Vince and triggered an explosion from the base of the hilt. The blast acted like a kinetic propellant, launching the longsword forward like a cannon projectile. Vince had no time to dodge. He tried to move enough to save his heart, but the blade still struck his shoulder. Thack! The momentum carried him backward for meters until he was pinned to a trunk, the sword embedded deep into the wood through his flesh. With eyes wide and pupils dilated, Vince coughed out a mouthful of blood, rasping and gasping before going limp. Meanwhile, using the recoil from that very same blast, Michael threw his weight backward. He slammed Lily into the loam just like before, breaking her hold, then springing away in a perfectly executed rolling backflip. Lily tried to scramble up, her mind panicking. How did this happen? How did she not see this coming? How did she not see that Michael was going to throw himself back and escape? Her prophetic vision was rendered ineffective. That's when her gaze lifted. The young man looming tall over her had already re-summoned his blade and was now bringing it down to skewer her. But more than the dread, what caught her attention was that his eyes were glowing with the exact same etheric violet light as hers. It dawned on her then. The split second after Michael fired off his sword, he copied Lily's origin card. Since Lily had never fought another true seer, she had no idea what would ensue. Now she did. When two seers clash, the future becomes a hall of mirrors. They don't see probabilities or certainties, they see nothing. Like now, every move Michael saw her make, she saw him see, and he saw her seeing him, until reality had to protect itself from paradoxes and cancel both their abilities out to preserve the continuity. Although Michael was a rank above Lily, he was being puppeteered by the god who eats is, fighting more on instinct than intellect. So he couldn't have upgraded the copied power to his level. And that was precisely why Lily was still alive. Not for long though. Catch! The shadow blade descended so fast it sliced through the air toward her gut. Lily shot her arms up to deflect the sword while pulling herself away at the same time. She was successful, to some extent. But the blade still punctured into her lower abdomen. Her mouth fell open into a silent scream. She felt the cold of the steel against the warmth of her own flesh like freezing needles. The pain was so excruciating that Lily felt like she'd never feel anything else ever again. As the agony numbed her will, her origin card dissipated into shimmering motes of light and her limbs turned to lead. Michael pulled the sword out and drew it overhead. Blood started pooling under her in a crimson puddle as she physically sensed the heat depleting from her body so fast she might as well have been lying naked in a snowstorm. Through the chill and through the fear, a strangled plea left her clattering teeth in a wet wheeze. Michael. Uncaring, Michael unleashed a clean slash. Chapter 345, Talent and Defiance 3. The shadow-wrapped blade of his longsword started traveling down in a lethal arc, poised to cleave Lily's head from her shoulders as she lay helpless on the ground. Thwack! But the blade was halted mid-descent as Michael turned and jerked the flat of his sword up to shield himself from a knee that came barreling at his face. Clang! A metallic groan rang out, and Michael was forced exactly 2 steps back. The entire left side of Ray's torso still bore ugly third-degree burns. His flesh was charred and deformed. If he hadn't concentrated nearly all of his essence on that spot at the last possible second to brace against Michael's previous attack, half his body would have been blown to smithereens. It was a mystery how he was still conscious. It was an even bigger mystery how he had recovered so quickly. Regardless, as soon as he forced himself to get back up, he went after Lily, who had gone in alone to help Vince. Unfortunately, what he saw when he scaled the cliff and entered the forest shook his core. Vince was slumped limply against a gnarled tree, a wet trail of crimson staining the bark behind his shoulder. And Lily was on the ground, a pool of blood widening beneath her. The dark stain on her lower abdomen told him she was rapidly running out of time. Ray's breath hitched in horror before he propelled himself forward like a rocket, introducing his knee to Michael's face. Or that was the plan, at least. But Michael blocked the blow just in time. That was fine, however, as Ray used his forward momentum to flip over, grabbing Michael by the gorget and converting his entire body into a living centrifuge, spinning across the Y-axis like a wagon wheel. As he sailed over Michael's head, Ray used the back of the gorget as a pivot point to yank the swordsman off his feet. Before he knew it, Michael was launched into the dense ferns and ancient trunks, crashing through the undergrowth until he tumbled out of view. Ray didn't even look to see where he landed. Instead, his gaze snapped toward Lily as he scrambled to her side, skidding to his knees through the pooling crimson. Not good, not good. There was too much blood. She would bleed to death at this rate. He looked at her pale face. Her breathing was shallow, more painful quivers than actual breaths. Her eyes were unfocused, the light in them slowly being snuffed out. Ray slapped her face gently, calling out in desperation. Lily, hey, Lily, keep breathing. Just keep circulating essence around your wound. It'll tighten the tissues and help stop the bleeding. It was easier said than done. To keep the circulation technique active, she needed to maintain a steady rhythm, which was a monumental task in her current state. But somehow, she managed to pull through. Her eyelashes fluttered weakly as she forced her draining focus to draw in deep breaths. The essence started to circulate bit by bit. It wasn't enough to stop the bleeding entirely, but it did slow the flow. Though Ray sighed in relief, he knew the situation was still dire. This had bought her, minutes instead of seconds. He had to end this battle fast before anyone else got hurt. Michael had to put all his weight on his longsword like a crutch just to stand straight. The shimmering white thread seeping from his chest, phasing through his armor and trickling toward the shore of the Lake of Grief, pulled taut, forcing him back into a battle stance. He was like a living marionette, made to fight endlessly by a cruel puppeteer uncaring of his condition. Swoo! That was when a fiery lance came zooming in from behind. Thanks to his future vision, Michael saw the attack long before it reached him and dodged by tossing himself to the right. Kaboom! The lance hit the spot on the ground he had occupied mere moments ago, detonating with the force of a truckload of TNT going off. The shockwave slammed into Michael, stealing his breath, but he braced himself and managed to keep his footing. He skidded back several paces, leaving deep grooves in the floor of wet moss and rotting leaves. In front of him was an enormous crater, thick black smoke and a suffocating cloud of pulverized earth pluming into the air. The overgrown vegetation and haunting greenery nearby were immediately incinerated, reduced to flakes of ash raining from the sky. Ray was dangerous. Even one of his concentrated lances was enough to decimate a small building. Fortunately, to conjure that lance, Ray needed to supercharge his explosive energy before giving it physical form. Moreover, he could only use 3 explosions in quick succession before a cooldown kicked in. So that lance was an ultimate move that he couldn't spam relentlessly. That brought Michael some solace, even as his lungs burned. If he was conscious, he would have noted his breath tasting of sulfur. He would have felt the mithering strain in his limbs and the skull-splitting ache at the back of his head. But since he wasn't conscious, he felt nothing. As such, he didn't slow down at all. Not until he spotted another bright projectile speeding through the haze. Michael quickly threw himself to the side once again. Just like before, the lance hit the ground and detonated. The resulting impact flung Michael further and hit him harder than he had prepared for. It was like being hit by a moving truck. Everything was still fine until then, however. Sure, the battle wasn't in his favor, but with his future sight, he could now move in and search the woods for Ray in the direction the boy was sniping from. As strong as Ray was, he would be no match in close combat once Michael got the chance to eat the distance between. Swoo! Something unexpected happened right then. While he was still being flung back, while he was still in midair before he had even landed, yet another incandescent lance descended onto him from the heavens, zeroing in with pinpoint precision. If Michael had been in his right mind, he would have been flabbergasted. How on earth was Ray able to release 2 back-to-back fiery lances? The answer was as simple as it was genius. Ray had stacked them. He had created one, waited for his cooldown to reset, and then created another. After that, he had lured Michael into such a compromising position where there was no way to evade, even with the copied power of future sight. Because to dodge the first lance, Michael had already jumped. The second lance, meanwhile, came when he was still airborne. With no ground to push against and no time to summon a defensive card, he was a falling duck. But Michael hadn't lost yet. Mustering all his strength, he whipped his arm forward and slung his shadowy longsword toward the incoming projectile. Kaboom! The third explosion went off prematurely, several meters above Michael's dark, tumbling figure. The aerial blast sent a circular tide of fire sweeping outward, momentarily clearing the smoke and revealing the skeletal silhouettes of the trees above. Because Michael had triggered the blast early, the lethal core of the explosion missed him, though he still felt the searing heat wave. Gravity finally claimed him, and he slammed into the damp earth, rolling through the ash until he hit a gnarled root. His sword, thrown by the force of the blast, buried itself point first into the ground a few feet away. Even with his body broken and his mind adrift, he knew it was imperative to reclaim his weapon. After all, challenging Ray empty-handed would be akin to inviting death with open arms. So ignoring the protests of his legs, he stood up. He willed essence into his feet and dashed onward at breakneck speed, outstretching for the hilt of his sword with his left hand. He was there in a blink. His fingers were inches away, so close he could almost feel the cursed steel on his skin. And it was still not close enough. Right before he could actually grab it, Ray burst through the curtain of smoke from the right, his fist wreathed in the concentrated embers of a fourth lance. It was the perfect play. Michael immediately understood Ray's strategy. First, Ray used the explosions as a smokescreen to cover his movements. Then, he forced Michael to part with his sword. Finally, he emerged from the right. Why from the right? Because Michael's right hand was mangled to the point it was useless. Ever since Ray had detonated a point-blank explosion on his vambrace, Michael hadn't been able to use that arm. In simple terms, even if Michael reached his sword with his left hand, he wouldn't be able to turn and parry this final blow in time. He couldn't escape this checkmate. Because this was a checkmate. This was a checkmate, right? Ray lashed out with everything he had left, gripping the fiery lance tight as he drove it toward the black-haired boy. But Michael took one step more than was necessary, and reached for the planted sword with his right hand instead. Those mutilated fingers of his, charred and unresponsive just moments ago, clamped firmly around the hilt. Impossible. Ray's eyes widened in the realization that he had been tricked. Michael had been fully capable of using his right hand from the very start, despite the splintered bone and damaged nerves. He had simply faked the extent of his injury, waiting for a moment exactly like this one. Of course, this realization came far too late. The next thing Ray knew was his own hand severed was at the wrist by a dark blade whistling through the air with a speed that defied human anatomy. The strike was so clean that there was a heartbeat of surreal silence before the spray of hot blood followed the arc of the blade. But Ray's momentum was already a physical law. Even as his hand was lopped off, the limb continued carrying the fiery lance forward until it rammed directly into the center of Michael's chest. Kaboom! Chapter 346. Talent and Defiance IV. The sheer force of that apocalyptic detonation sent both young men flying in opposite directions. Michael was hurled back like a weightless paper doll. His body skipped several times across the charred earth before slamming into the base of one of those ancient trees. The impact was enough to rattle the very roots, sending a final rain of ash and dead leaves down upon him. He lay there, motionless. His matte black armor was rapidly disintegrating into twinkling motes of dark light, leaving only the scorched remains of his undergarments and the raw, burned skin of his chest behind. The shimmering white thread was still there, seeping out of his sternum and flowing toward the faraway horizon. Ray fared no better. In fact, his condition was worse. He tumbled through the haze of the settling ash, his path smeared by a bloody trail of crimson. He came to a halt near the edge of the crater he himself had created moments ago, clutching the stump of his arm while grunting and crying and thrashing around in pain unimaginable. The forest around them had become a graveyard of smoldering, bowl-shaped depressions and clouds of suffocating dust. Once Ray went still, the silence that followed was deafening. The only sound now present was the distant lap of waves against the sandy shore of the Lake of Grief. Michael's eyes remained vacant, staring up at the fractured sky through the skeletal branches. With his short breaths slowing into shallow gasps, he remained unresponsive for a long time. Until he wasn't. All of a sudden, with a renewed sense of false vigor, he straightened in his position and wheeled his longsword forward. Clang! A loud metallic chime rang, like steel striking steel. Even though no one was standing before him, Michael looked like he was struggling to push an invisible foe back. At last, he seemed to win the struggle. He hoisted himself to his feet and quickly repelled the unseen force pressuring him down. Then, he twisted the sword and swiped it in a sharp reverse swing. Thack! The sound that resounded this time was that of something solid splitting under the sharp edge of his dark blade. Immediately after, two even halves of a perfectly cut card appeared from thin air and disappeared just as fast in a rain of light sparks. Simultaneously, a beautiful girl with braided white hair and glacial eyes, which were as icy blue as they were magnetic, appeared right in front of him. She seemed to have ducked just in time to avoid being cleaved by his sword and was now crouching low. Before she could pounce and make use of either the wakizashi or the katana in her grip, Michael used the pivoting momentum of his earlier swing to whip his leg around. Although Juliana managed to lift her short blade to block the strike in time, the brutal roundhouse kick still connected with enough force to send her rolling sideways across the uneven, soot-covered ground. But of course, just this much wasn't enough to keep her down for the count. In fact, Juliana didn't even struggle to get back on her feet. She bounced with the momentum and transitioned into a light-footed stance. She didn't look frustrated, either. If anything, she had a playful yet unnerving smile on her face. Slowly, she raised her wakizashi and tilted it so the dim light of the burning grove could catch the fluid sliding down its surface. It was dripping with fresh blood. I can hurt you now, Tilda. Juliana giggled, her melodic voice discordant against the unsettling backdrop. A deep gash had opened across Michael's shin where he had delivered the kick. Juliana hadn't just blocked the strike, she had angled her blade in a way that let his own momentum drive his flesh into her steel. Even as out of it as Michael was, he instinctively realized this was going to be a tough one. You really are a sturdy one, aren't you? She mused, her cold eyes locking onto his vacant ones. On top of that, your armor was really problematic. It really was. After just a couple of exchanges when this whole thing started, Juliana understood she couldn't pierce through his defenses alone. Not only was Michael constantly imbuing his armor with essence, but a good number of churning shadows from his sword had also enveloped it to make it ridiculously durable. And then there was the problem with the amount of essence he was spending. His reserves seemed unending as he kept on boosting himself and his items without any care for ever running out of fuel. That was obviously because of the entity controlling him, Juliana had concluded. Nonetheless, the main issue was his armor. They had to break him out of it like a snail from its shell if they wanted to truly subdue him. So, naturally, Juliana had conveyed a plan to the rest of the group with Ray at its vanguard. She had hoped that no matter how tough the shell, a truckload of TNT delivered directly to the sternum would be enough to crack it. And she had been right. Ray's final, desperate gambit had done exactly what it was meant to do. It had stripped Michael of his impenetrable defense. It had taken more effort than she'd originally thought, because Michael was a monster, his origin card was practically a cheat, and his battle IQ was formidable. But in the end, the playing field was finally even now. Well, since her condition was far better than his, she was tempted to declare herself at an advantage, but she also knew not to underestimate his skills. This really was going to be a tough one. Juliana spun her katana in a dazzling circle, the air whistling against it as she prepared for a second exchange. You know, I haven't been myself ever since this journey started. First, my leg kept getting injured in the same spot. Then there were a lot of things weighing on my mind, even during the events of the night sanctuary. Most of which I still haven't processed, she shrugged. Not to mention, I was way out of my comfort zone. A lot of that I blame on Kevin. But damn, I miss that bird. Her fingers tightened around her swords. Still, even now in his absence, I find you guys tolerable. Like I don't want to stab you every waking moment of the day. Which I know still sounds concerning, but it's very strange for me. Believe me, Juliana expelled her breath through clenched teeth. Especially since you all represent the epitome of everything I find irritating. I mean, why would you distribute food and cards so generously? Why was your girlfriend just handing out healing potions without any catch? Do you people have no sense of hoarding resources? She glowered. Why would Vince offer me his gloves when I ignored him while he fell? Why would Ray brew his stupid tea every single day just for me to throw it away? And why the fuck would that blind shorty save me when I couldn't care less about her? Michael suddenly launched himself forward, unwilling to listen to the rest of her monologue. He crossed the distance in a flash, but Juliana had already sprung onto a nearby tree branch. Looking down at him slicing at nothing, she made a gesture of her exploding. It's baffling. At first, I thought you all had some ulterior motive. Or that this was just desperate ass licking for survival, so the group may continue to stick together. But oh my god, was I wrong? Slowly, dreadfully, I realized you were all just that stupid. Her eyes narrowed. Because only stupid people could be so uncharacteristically, unconditionally kind. Right. Michael charged once again, this time obliterating the entire tree she stood on with a single swing of his longsword. And once again, Juliana escaped by leaping onto another branch with a ballerina's grace. Or maybe it's just me. Maybe since I've never been treated with unconditional kindness, except by one boy. I mistake it for lack of logic, for schemes and ruses. The last time someone showed me kindness like that, he also showed me that people change. And that hurts. She groaned softly, as if irritated with her own words. Arg, whatever. I guess what I want to say is, try to resist, Michael. I really don't want to kill you, that much. Because make no mistake, I will kill you. You may be stronger than I am. You may be more skilled than I am. You may even be able to see the future right now. But I am the one who has already decided the end of this duel. If you fight me, I will win. So, what's your answer? The black-haired boy raised his guard in reply, brandishing his cursed sword to deliver yet another devastating blow. Juliana's smile returned at that, blossoming wider this time. Good, I was hoping for that. She fell into her own stance by standing to her full height, one foot gliding ahead of the other and her twin blades drawn low. Let's dance, then, shall we? Then she vanished again, not through magic, but through pure, blinding speed. Chapter 347, Talent and Defiance v. Any type of immediate precognition was a direct counter to Juliana's power. Because she relied heavily on quick feints and treacherous misdirections to overwhelm strong opponents, her efforts were rendered useless against someone who could see through the deception. Still, Michael's reactions weren't as fast as she had feared. Having already taken a direct hit from one of Ray's lances, he was lagging. The exhaustion of the battle was finally catching up to him. His essence reserves still remained inexhaustible, yes, since the god who eats as was constantly supplying him with fuel, but he was physically reaching its absolute limit. Yet, credit where it was due, he was still moving with enough efficiency to not only parry and deflect but also actively counterattack. Truly, he was a monster in a league of his own. Clang, 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 the ringing of metal reverberated through the otherwise silent forest. The beasts previously occupying this territory had long since fled when the god's presence was first unleashed. Every time their weapons met, the resulting shockwaves rocked the nearby trees. Both fighters were a zipping blur, going all in with the intent to kill. Michael was slower, but he made up for it with his surgical precision. Juliana, on the other hand, fully utilized her superior speed and agility. She knew if she could only widen the gap between his sight and his movements by a fraction of a second, the fight would be over with her blade to his heart. She subjected him to a relentless assault of her twin blades, with attacks that were as deceitful as they were fast. One moment she was charging head-on, the next she would rewind the time of her own body, swiveling around him for a backstab. 1 second she was mid-air, seemingly about to be impaled by his longsword, only to flicker out of sight and reappear to his left, aiming for the vulnerable gap in his flank. It was frustrating to deal with her. But more frustrating was the fact how easily Michael answered her strikes. Still, as the number of their exchanges kept dragging on and beads of cold sweat began to drip down her forehead, Juliana felt the katana and wakizashi in her hands growing lighter and lighter. The more they fought, the more wounds they both accumulated. None of them were anything serious, just some shallow scrapes and scratches. But every single drop of blood, no matter how tiny, that fell from Michael only worked in Juliana's favor, enhancing the ferocity of damage done by her sharp blades little by little. Why? Because one of the cards she had equipped, Bleeding Edge effect, temporarily coats the user's weapon with energy that causes additional bleeding damage. Samael had given it to her when he woke up. She didn't know why, but it was proving invaluable. The more wounds her swords carved open, the more they seemed to possess a mind of their own, a mind solely focused on finding the enemy and making them bleed. The fight from here on out was just going to be formality. Juliana would continue getting faster while Michael would just slow down until he was put down. It's over. I win, she began to think, but that thought was interrupted. What? Michael suddenly changed not only his conduct but his entire temperament. He abandoned his precise, calculated slashes in favor of raw savagery. Instead of focusing on defense, parries, and blocks, he adopted a wide swinging style that left his entire guard open. Caught by surprise, Juliana had no time to alter her momentum. She had been banking on his caution, on the meticulous way he was using his future sight to shut down her feints. But by throwing away his guard, Michael had effectively rendered her misdirections moot. You cannot feint against someone who refuses to acknowledge the threat of a strike, after all. Her slender katana met his brutal longsword and was battered down, its dull edge pressed hard against her own shoulder. She thrust her wakizashi forward, stabbing Michael in the shoulder, but the boy didn't care in the least. Instead of flinching, he followed through with his swing and flung Juliana back as if she weighed nothing. What the hell? She screamed internally, crashing against a solid tree trunk, plowing through a patch of ferns, and rolling down a steep slope into a hidden meadow. She coughed into the dirt before quickly rising. The grass and flowers here were as tall as she was, acting as natural curtains to hide the movements of her pursuer. But Michael wasn't pursuing her with stealth anymore. The meadow groaned as he landed with enough force to flatten the flora in a wide radius. He looked less like a swordsman and more like a wounded predator. Blood from the puncture wound in his shoulder streamed down his mangled right arm, but he paid it no mind as he rushed forward. Juliana met him, increasing her speed severalfold. Clang! This time when their swords clashed, the shockwaves were so sharp they cut down the tall grass around them. The meadow, once swaying with an abundance of greenery, was being systematically harvested by the sheer pressure of their collision. Juliana felt her heart hammering against her ribs. This wasn't a duel anymore. It was a meat grinder. Every time she rewound her position to strike from a blind spot, Michael was already there, swinging with a reckless abandon that forced her to abandon her own offense just to keep her limbs attached. He was no longer trying to outthink her. He didn't care about getting hurt, so long as he kept the injuries from being fatal. He was simply out-existing her. As long as she was in more pain than him, he was good with it. This style of animalistic fighting reminded her so much of Samael. He's burning out, she realized, parrying a blow that sent a numbing vibration up to her elbows. He has to be. No human body can sustain this. Her weapon still felt weightless, moving almost faster than her own thoughts, guided by a thirst for that monster's blood. That was when she saw an opening. Michael pulled back for another heavy haymaker, his chest heave-hawing. Juliana seized that chance to blink to his exposed side, planting her shorter blade directly into his ribs. Couch. It didn't feel right. The blade plunged deep, but not deep enough. She was aiming to pierce his liver, but the wakizashi stopped just short of it, wedged into his muscle and ribcage even though she had applied enough force to shatter bone. Panicking, she tried to retrieve her blade and back the fuck off from there, only to find it wouldn't budge. Her blade wouldn't budge. Oh, she had a realization. It was a trap. Michael had used essence to harden his muscles and his bones. Then, he intentionally invited her in to strike him there. By doing so, he had essentially turned his own body into a living trap. That realization was late, because in the next second, Michael brought up his sword, twirled it once overhead, then twisted his torso and whipped his heavy blade toward the short sword still stuck in the side of his ribs. Crack! Her wakizashi snapped under the unbearable pressure. The tip remained buried in his flesh while the rest of the steel flew into the tall grass. Juliana stumbled back, the hilt of her broken sword still in her hand. But Michael wasn't done. He switched his sword to a reverse grip and finished the combo by bashing the pommel of his longsword into her nose. Thwack! Chapter 348. Talent and Defiance B. Disoriented, Juliana staggered a couple of steps like a drunk. Before Michael could think about finishing her, however, she began rewinding, blurring to a stop behind him. At moments like these, she wondered why her powers couldn't reverse the damage too. Why only momentum? Oh well, she made the best of what she was given. Now, if Michael could think, he would have taken a moment to do so and ask himself why Juliana would appear behind him. Why was she still sticking so close instead of retreating? Clearly, she had something planned, a trick was still up her sleeve. But he couldn't think, so he didn't. He just whirled, using the momentum of his spin to carry out a heinous slash. While Juliana did manage to block it with her katana, she was still sent flying back once again. This time, she was launched back up the slope and into the woods. Just like before, she crashed through the underbrush and collided with a sturdy tree at the edge of the clearing. And just like before, she coughed and struggled to rise. Leaning against the trunk, she hoisted herself up and started trudging deeper into the forest. Seeing this, Michael rushed up the incline. He didn't care that his ribcage was still housing the tip of her shattered blade. He saw only his target. So he ran after her, catching up within seconds before lunging high to come for one final execution swing. Juliana threw herself aside at the last possible moment as he plummeted down, his longsword cracking a massive fissure into the forest floor where she had stood a heartbeat prior. But Juliana didn't keep running. Instead, she spun on her heel and tried to retaliate, but the boy yanked his sword up first. She managed to block the slash once again with the dull of her katana, but the impact forced her back until she bumped into a boulder and sagged slightly. Catching her breath, she looked down at her curved blade. Ah, damn it, there was a hairline fracture on the steel. That soured her mood more than anything she'd been put through in the last half hour. Up ahead, she saw Michael sprinting toward her for one last charge. For some reason, at that moment, she closed her eyes and her mind drifted back to thoughts of her mother. She remembered how religiously she used to watch her train when she was little. Spending her afternoons seeing her mother swing her swords had been Juliana's favorite pastime. Her mother's sword art was as beautiful as the woman herself. Juliana had been too small to understand the depth of it back then, but now, when she compared her own movements to those memories, she realized how much she lacked. Her mother had been on a whole different level. Her footwork was like water, sometimes a calm stream, other times a crushing tide. She had always told Juliana that the sword was not a tool for hitting things, but an extension of one's own soul. If your heart is loud, if your mind is in turmoil, you will miss the music of the battle. This was her favorite thing to say. Of course, Juliana had been too young to understand any of it. Even now, she couldn't fully comprehend it. In fact, she was now convinced her mother just spouted profoundly insightful nonsense just to sound cool. Still, one particular memory she'd all but forgotten came flooding back, so vivid it might as well have happened yesterday. It was the first day of spring. The sunlight was warm against Juliana's skin, and it felt good since she'd been suffering from a 3-day-old cold. Following her usual routine, she was watching her mother practice a set of movements with her twin swords, only these weren't the usual katas she normally performed. Juliana recalled frowning. "Is that a new technique, Mama?" she asked with her runny nose, even though she hated speaking through a sore throat. Her mother turned to her. The light summer dress she wore fluttered in the breeze of their massive garden. Standing in that field of blue roses against the backdrop of their beautiful estate, there was a sense of serenity about her as she wiped the sweat from her face and smiled a luminous smile. She looked so pretty, so pleasing to the eye, that if someone had told Juliana her mama was a runaway princess from a faraway fairy tale land, she'd have believed them in a heartbeat. "Yes, sweetheart, do you like it?" Even her voice was like a calm melody. "I developed this myself. It's called Fall Before Spring. Your mum is quite talented, you know." Juliana blinked. It looks so sad, but so calming. Her mother laughed. "That emotion is called bittersweet, honey. This sword art is meant to represent life, and life is bittersweet." Without sorrow, we won't know how to cherish happiness. Without ache, we won't strive for comfort. Joy exists because there is sadness. Spring is lively because winter is forlorn. Juliana's frown hardened. Are you saying winter is bad? I like winter, you know. You catch a cold every winter. Oh, wow, okay. Juliana had no reply for that. Her silence prompted her mother to chuckle again. I'm not saying winter is bad. But now that you have a cold, don't you want to be healthy again so you can comfortably swallow your food? So you can sleep without a headache? Juliana quickly bobbed her little head as her mother dismissed her swords and walked up to her. Crouching, the beautiful lady continued, I'm saying no matter how long the wait is for the good times, it always ends. You can't keep mourning things. You have to move forward believing the best years of your life are still ahead. After thinking about it for a bit, Juliana looked uncertain. How do you know? How do I know what, honey? How do you know the wait always ends? That spring will come, that the cold will pass, and that winter will be over. What if it doesn't? It was her mother's turn to look thoughtful now. Juliana truly thought she would reassure her, perhaps give her one of those profound speeches. But instead, she just shrugged. I don't, I don't know, she repeated. And though she was smiling still, she looked distant, as if reminiscing about something bittersweet. But I believe it does. Because it has ended for me. Spring has come for me. And though I know it will soon end as well, I think my life has been good. Before Juliana could respond, her mother reached out and began caressing her cheeks lovingly. This time, she looked a little sad, as if thinking about a winter yet to come. The same way I know your life will be tough. But trust me when I say, Julie, you can't give up on hope. You have to keep believing. Don't forsake your own happiness, ever. Juliana was so small she couldn't have possibly understood the weight of those words then. She didn't remember how she answered. All she remembered was those soft lips as they kissed her forehead before her mother stood up to summon her swords again. When the day's practice was over, Juliana was strolling back to the mansion with her hand wrapped around her mother's pinky finger. Mama, will I be as talented as you? Her mother looked down at her in amusement. Jealousy at such a young age. You really are my daughter. I'm not jealous, Mama. She rolled her eyes. You're just so good, will I ever be as good as you? You don't have to worry about that yet, dummy. Go make some friends instead of being so reclusive all the time. Her mother's hand pinched her plump cheek until she squealed. But if you want the truth, then yes. You will be. Because, my love, you're not just born with talent. You're born in defiance of it. The walk back was mostly silent after that. Juliana, as always, wasn't yet aware of the gravity of those words. But she moved on quickly from those worries, for she had bigger properties arranged in her mind. Like, will I also be as pretty as you, then? Okay, so she was a little jealous of her mother, so what? It was easy to be jealous of the people you idolize. Her mother burst into a fit of laughter, leaving her embarrassed. Oh, honey, yes. Yes, of course you will. You know, I never took care of my appearance when I was young. But after meeting your father, I really changed. Juliana practically had stars in her eyes. Really, you mean falling for Papa made you beautiful? So love makes you pretty? Her mother seemed confused. What? No, silly, I was always pretty. Your papa just had a lot of money. Juliana was utterly horrified at the implications of that revelation. Her mother took offense. Hey, don't stare at me like that. Do you have any idea how costly skincare products for Awakened are? What I'm saying is, if you ever find a man or woman you fall for, make sure to steal plenty of money from them to maintain your appearance, okay? Then slowly train them to shower you with expensive gifts. So don't ever fall for poor people. Oh, wow, okay. Juliana was stunned into silence for the second time that day. Maybe instead of a pretty princess, her mother had been an opportunistic thief in that faraway fairy tale land. Haha, a soft smile found its way on Juliana's lips. How had she forgotten about that, about her mother's vanity and wisdom, or lack thereof? She realized there were many memories like that one she had kept buried away, and had instead subconsciously chosen to remember her parents as some sort of perfect people. She'd put them on a pedestal so they'd feel untouchable. But they had their moments, too. They had their flaws, too. They fought and worried and laughed and loved like anyone else. She had chosen to not remember those human, happy parts of them, only nostalgia that she found comfortable. Because if she remembered those happy times, she would eventually have to mourn their end too. But did she have to? It was a bitter feeling that her family was gone, but the brief time she spent with them was too sweet to ever be forgotten. Life was bittersweet like that, right? Spring had passed and winter had come. And while she thought she was okay with never feeling the warmth of the sun on her skin again, she really wasn't. She wanted to relive the fragrance of flowers in a massive garden. She wanted to enjoy the taste of ice cream on a hot summer day, and she wanted to keep that ridiculous advice about stealing from rich boyfriends close to her heart. She was tired and she was afraid, but she wanted genuine connections. She wanted her spring back. Her eyes felt wet as she opened them. Taking a deep breath, Juliana ignored the throb in her broken nose and the exhaustion threatening to buckle her knees. She stopped worrying about the fracture in her blade and pushed back up, crouching to take a fluid stance with her katana pointing forward. Her mother's words were much more fathomable now than they were back then. Talent was a gift, defiance was a choice, and she was born with the will to make that choice. That was her true nature. Michael was less than 2 paces away when she began her own charge. It was a cinematic clash as both swung their blades, a clangorous climax that drowned out the rustle of the woods. Michael's savage cleave met Juliana's rising parry, but the hairline fracture on her katana was a death sentence. The crack widened until her blade shattered into a dozen glittering pieces. Her main sword broke as well. Michael pivoted instantly to transition his momentum into a one-handed thrust. The long sword hissed through the air. Juliana veered the strike off course with her broken hilt, but it was not enough. Couch. His blade ultimately bit through her clothes, then through her flesh and breastbone. It punched through her body and sunk inches deep, enough to pierce the spot where her heart should have been. With that, the fight was over. Juliana slumped forward, strength leaving her body as a thin line of blood trickled from the corner of her lips. She raised her gaze to peer into Michael's vacant, ashen eyes, and found him to be crying. Michael Godswill was crying this whole time, but she had only now noticed those heavy tears running down his face even as his expression remained unchanged. "You idiot," she wheezed. "If you were going to cry, you should have tried to resist. Now I'll feel bad if you die." The last part was merely a whisper. It didn't even reach Michael's ears until she suddenly surged upright and grabbed his right forearm with a grip of a garrote, her blood slicking the dark steel of his blade. Yeah, this had obviously been a bait. A trick she'd taken right out of his own playbook. By letting him impale her, she had finally done the impossible. She had ensnared him. What use was seeing the future if he couldn't move to avoid it? Michael barely had time to register it before Juliana twisted his arm. At the same time, a kunai soaked with poison she'd harvested from the two-headed serpent burst up from under the soil. Many things made sense all of a sudden. Starting with how Juliana had subtly manipulated the direction of this battle to end up in this exact spot where she had prepared a trap. In fact, there were likely dozens of kunai hidden underground here. It also made sense why she chose to divert Michael's killing blow with a broken sword instead of just retreating. And at last, it made sense why the rune of the bloodworm was on her right clavicle instead of left where her heart was supposed to be. Apparently, Juliana Vox Blade, along with the will to defy, was also born with a medical condition that offset her heart to be more on the right. This was never a noble duel of swords. This was an ambush, but Michael grasped it too late. The kunai had already skewered him. His elbow joint was shattered. His grip on his sword finally went slack as Juliana kicked him hard in the chest. Michael lurched back, fell into a roll, and struggled to his knees, only to see another kunai come whistling toward him. Couch. This one lodged into his right eye. Michael screamed and growled, clutching at the dagger protruding from his socket, but the neurotoxin from the two-headed snake was already melting his motor functions. He still tried to fight it and pick himself up, but yet another kunai streaked in and broke his left knee joint, making him crumble to the side. Now, the fight was over. Chapter 349. Gods and Monsters. I hate getting struck by lightning. In my entire life, I'm fortunate enough to say I've only been struck by lightning twice. Thankfully, the day I fought against the god who eats us was not one of those days. The multi-armed deity raised his Vajra and took aim. My right arm was missing. In its place was an artificial limb conjured from ice. Another arm of ice was attached to my back, accompanying a third made from stone. In total, I now had 4 hands. Which was still 2 fewer than the god I was facing. But oh well, we can't get everything we want in life, can we? It wasn't even a matter of being unable to create more limbs. I simply didn't have the mental capacity to actively control all of them in a fight. My right ice arm was already knocking a fire arrow, while the stone arm on my back gripped a flame lash. With my real hand of flesh and bone, I gripped my blazing axe. Yeah, I was looking like something of a deity myself. Gurthum, a majestic bolt of lightning discharged from the tip of the Vajra. I didn't have time to move before it struck. Because obviously, I couldn't move faster than light, or even 1/3 of it yet. So it ended up hitting me. But instead of frying me from the inside out, a soft shimmer rippled in the air around my body before the bolt was reflected back at the creature that had sent it. Mirror Cloak. Effect. Summons a magical cloak that reflects any ranged attack, projectile or spell, aimed at the wearer. The cloak must be resummoned after one use. Of course, the god didn't even blink. Not that he could sense his hollow eyes lacked eyelids. He just reacted by lifting a warhammer and tanking the stair-step beam of electricity head-on. Still, that confirmed one thing. While all his weapons were surely supreme or mythical grade, the total output of his attacks was nowhere near their maximum potential. That was because the god's body was capped at the level of an A- rank hunter or a greater rank beast. His own flesh was a bottleneck, choking the essence he needed to flood his weapons with for them to work at full power. That didn't make them any less dangerous, but it did give me a fighting chance. A huge chance. I noticed then that the god had suddenly stopped moving his disjointed fingers connected to the ethereal white strands. That could mean only one thing: his puppet was down. Michael Godswill was finally defeated. Yet, he still didn't let go of the strands. That was because the god fed on them, the threads of fate belonging to another entity. Well, he didn't feed on the threads themselves, but the divinity they were woven from. I didn't know how it worked. I still don't know how it worked to this day. I'd planned to ask Asmodeus, but I just forgot the next time I saw him. Anyway, that was the reason the god hadn't killed us when he had opportunities. He only slowed our advance because he wanted to keep us in his feeding grounds longer, until he could finish devouring Michael's existence before moving on to the next meal. Then the next, then the next. That was also why he was being so hesitant to outright kill me. Earlier, when he cleaved my hand off with his serrated disc blade, I was left dazed by the pain for a moment. He had the chance to finish me with his Vajra right then, but he didn't. He waited until I could clamp my muscles down with essence to stop the bleeding before resuming the attack. That irked me more than anything. Who the fuck did this dude think he was, going easy on me? Gnashing, I charged forward as a salvo of icy spikes rose from the frozen platform under my feet, launching toward the fallen deity. Just like before, the god used his trident to manipulate the water all around him, creating wavy tentacles that reduced my volley to nothing but harmless slush. But I wasn't done. While he was busy playing with his waterworks, I adjusted my grip on the flame lash. The stone arm on my back moved with a heavy, grinding sound to snap the whip of fire through the humid air. The god raised his crooked staff of bone and gold to create a shroud of turbulent air before him, ready to displace the lash's trajectory. However, I didn't hurl the lash at him. Instead, the fiery rope fell short by a couple of paces, striking the chilly water between us just outside the edge of my ice island. A massive cloud of vapor erupted as fire met water, obscuring his six-eyed vision. The god didn't panic. Gods rarely do, as I've come to realize now, but he did hesitate. I felt the air pressure shift as I entered close quarters. He swung his warhammer blindly through the fog at the sound of my approach, the weight of that heavy block of metal whistling inches above my head as I ducked. He was still capped at A rank. His reaction speed was tied to a physical form that, while monstrous, was still bound by the laws of biology. I let my momentum slide me forward, freezing the sea beneath my feet. With my real hand, I raised the axe. With the stone hand, I coiled the lash around his trident. With the ice hand, I drew the fire arrow back and released it at point-blank range, aiming for the center of his face while simultaneously bringing the axe down at the junction where his right neck met his shoulder. ... And I immediately realized the futility of it all. The boom of the fire arrow so close up and the heavy thwack of my axe hitting meat should have been the sounds of victory. Instead, they were the sounds of a very expensive lesson in divine biology. You see, you couldn't kill a divine being with mortal weapons. You couldn't even hurt one, no matter how strong the weapon was. You could only do that with intent, or more specifically, with your spiritual pressure. Now, spiritual pressure or spirit force is a sort of pressure that all beings of higher rank exert on reality. Think of it like gravity. When the mass of an object increases, so does its gravitational pull, right? In the same manner, when the metaphysical size of your soul expands with each rank up, so does the weight it puts on reality. That's why, at higher ranks, an awakened could rupture reality with their spiritual pressure alone to open portals under the right conditions. Anyway, the point is that since gods, even fallen ones, are so one with reality, you could only kill them with your spiritual pressure. I didn't know this back then. So, when my axe failed to bury itself into his shoulder junction, it didn't feel like cutting through flesh. It felt like trying to cut a mountain of compressed rubber with a butter knife. The blade couldn't even bite through the top layer of the god's skin. As for the fire arrow, it hit him square in the center of his face. The explosion was a brilliant bloom of orange and red. But when the smoke cleared a millisecond later, he wasn't missing a head as he looked down at me. Then, he lashed out with his khopesh. The arm nearest to me blurred up in a horizontal arc. He was aiming for the waist, intending to turn my deity-like form into two separate, much shorter pieces. My ice arms were empty. My stone arm was occupied. My real hand was out of position. Now I could jump back, sure, but that would allow the god to bring his warhammer back around and swat me like a fly. What should I choose? A few possibly broken bones or getting chopped in half. It was an impossible choice, really. And I had exactly half a second to decide if I wanted to spend the rest of my life as a pair of legs. So, I decided against it. I disengaged and jumped back, evading a slash that would have very well divided me right then and there. But as expected, as soon as my feet left the ground, the air pressure shifted at my side with the weight of a falling mountain. The god pivoted his imposing torso, and the warhammer reversed its momentum with a terrifying, bone-grinding hum. Wham! The flat of the hammer caught me in the ribs. Even with my stone arm moving to soften the blow, the impact rattled my organs. I was sent skipping across the surface of the ice island like a flat stone on a lake, my artificial limbs shattering into dust. I careened into a jagged frost pillar at the rim of the platform that I didn't remember creating. The crash was enough to force the air out of my lungs in a wet wheeze. My vision swam with static. But it was not yet the end of my misery. Because the force of the collision was so great that the pillar shattered as I rammed through it and tumbled over the edge, falling into the cold depths of the lake of grief. The god decided he still hadn't had enough. So he stepped onto my little ice island and moved to its center. Then, he raised his Vajra to shoot a blinding thunderbolt into the fractured sky. Immediately, somewhere up above, stormy clouds blanketed the stratosphere and the atmosphere turned heavy with the scent of rain. The god raised the crooked staff next. As if on cue, the clouds started swirling into a cyclonic vortex directly above the lake. He wasn't just planning to electrocute me, it seemed. He was calling down a divine judgment. Gurthoom. A pillar of white-hot lightning thundered down into the silver water, vaporizing a big portion of this virtually endless sea. For a few following moments, there was silence. The god looked almost certain that he had gone overboard and killed me. If I had waited a couple more moments, he'd have turned around and gone back to my companions. But I didn't wait. Swoosh. Under normal circumstances, the water should have become a giant electrolyte conductor, frying me instantly as I sank. But when the current raced through the freezing depths, I had activated another one of my defense cards. Scale Hide. Effect. Transforms user's skin into semi-draconic scales to protect against physical attacks, highly effective against elemental attacks, especially fire. Sure, it didn't protect me from the shot completely, but I at least didn't become barbecued seafood. In the very next second, a leviathan made of ice emerged from the sea's surface. I was riding atop its head as it continued climbing up, elevating me skyward. From my right, a fast streak of golden light was splitting through the horizon like a shooting star. The god instinctively realized I was planning something, so he didn't wait for me to commit. He whipped his serrated disc blade at me. I had expected that, so I had already willed the ginormous sea serpent of ice I was riding to block it. A massive tail burst out from the water, rising to intercept the incoming disc. Whaam. It sounded like a glacier shattering when the disc didn't stop at all. It plowed through the Leviathan construct. It tore through it like a knife through cardboard. Shards of frost rained down into the lake of grief as my makeshift mount groaned under the kinetic force and started to collapse into a heap of frozen rubble. Yet, it bought me the one thing the god had tried to starve me of, time. The disc slowed down enough for me to evade it as I rushed up to the gigantic snout of my conjured beast and leapt off. The golden streak of light had reached me. And the next thing I knew, I was wrapping my fingers around the hilt of a greatsword. After a long wait, my divine blade, Oriath, was finally here. Chapter 350, gods and monsters too. Are you familiar with that frustrating feeling when you're in a ditch you can't get out of by yourself, so you call a friend to help? But while that friend does end up coming, they take their sweet goddamn time doing so. In that moment, you're not sure whether you want to be more thankful or beat the ever-living shit out of them. That was exactly the internal crisis I had to go through when I held Oriath again after a little over a month. But all that tension bled out of me soon, replaced by a confident calm as the golden blade glowed brighter in response to my essence. I grinned and spun in midair before cartwheeling down, letting gravity do its work while also building immense momentum on my own. The god took a single step back as I crashed with the force of a falling meteor, cratering the frozen ground under the flattening weight of my greatsword. The fallen deity immediately retaliated by snapping his warhammer at me. I blocked with Oriath, although the impact still shook my arm and flicked me away several feet back. I landed with a perfect backflip, immediately forming a small glacier to offer me proper footing. In that time, I had not only created another ice arm to replace the one that broke earlier, but had also switched Oriath into its bow form. Yes, bow form, because it had been so long since I used my divine sword, and I'm fairly certain you've forgotten all about its enchantments. Here's a quick rundown. Name Oriath, the divine blade. Rank undefined, soulbound artifact. Type armament, item artifact. Enchantment 1. Final gambit. When the wielder faces mortal peril, Oriath's power surges exponentially, turning the tide of battle in their favor. The closer to death, the greater its lethality. 2. Trinity. Oriath can seamlessly shift between 3 forms: an executioner greatsword, twin single-edged longswords, and a regal bow. 3. Celestial furnace converts the wielder's raw essence into pure light energy, fueling devastating attacks imbued with divine brilliance. 4. Conduit. While held, Oriath subtly enhances the wielder's essence absorption, accelerating recovery and strengthening their reserves. Ah, truly, what a spectacle of craftsmanship it was. Tilda. I missed you so much, buddy. I murmured, knocking one fire arrow after another and letting them loose in blistering succession like an artillery battery. The arrows were imbued with the effects of celestial furnace, so not only were they being shot like beams of light, but their destructive capabilities had also increased tenfold. Dear gods, this whole hellish journey would have been so much easier if I'd just had this sword with me from the start. Oh, speaking of gods, the god used his trident in my answer and summoned a vast tidal wave that rose before him. The arrows, greatly enhanced by Oriath's enchantment and my own essence, hit that curling waterfall like a flurry of missiles. A series of steam explosions and violent splashes triggered, completely shredding the tsunami that was about to follow suit after that tidal wave. Massive plumes of superheated vapor hissed upward, veiling the entire battlefield in a misty fog. But I didn't stop firing. Not until that same serrated disc blade from before ripped through the haze and came spiraling toward me. Of course, unlike before, I was ready. I quickly switched Oriath back into its greatsword form and unleashed a blinding pillar of light from its tip, catching the speeding disc dead on with the force of a supernova. The collision resulted in a high-pitched whine of metal. But the serrated disc still did not stop. It just kept on coming, parting the torrential beam of light as it ground its way toward my skull. My effort wasn't in vain, though. Its spin was slowing down slightly. Noticing that, I tilted my greatsword just a fraction of a degree. Instead of meeting the disc in a frontal contest, I let it slide along the flat of the golden blade. The screech of metal on metal was loud enough to scrape my eardrums, but it diverted the disc's trajectory. The disc whistled past my ear, taking a lock of hair with it, and carved a clean, mile-long trench through the frozen sea behind me. But in doing so, I was left off balance. The god capitalized on that slip-up by barreling through the fog. I had only a moment to widen my eyes before he drove his obsidian stake of a needle into my chest, impaling me on the spot. Or that's what would have happened. In reality, my form shriveled and disintegrated into twinkling specks of black light, like dark fireflies scattering in the night. It was thanks to a card I had taken from Lily. Grave mistake. Effect. Creates a short-lived shadow clone that dissipates into dark motes upon impact. The caster is invisible for 3 seconds after activation. The god's obsidian stake passed through nothing but empty air and fading embers. He had overextended, and the momentum of his heavy body was now carrying him forward into the space I had just occupied. And as the fog swirled around his confused, 6-armed, multi-headed silhouette, I appeared directly above him. I had used those 3 seconds of invisibility to jump high. He didn't have time to look up as the dazzling blade of my greatsword came down in a vertical slash to burst open his skull like a guillotine. Swoo, wah, but my sword met no resistance as it dissected the fallen deity. It just felt like cutting air. The god's form rippled like a reflection in a disturbed pond, and I realized I had made a grave mistake of my own. It turned out, the god had pulled the exact same trick on me. He had created a mirage. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. My eyes darted frantically to find him, but he was nowhere to be found. Until, behind me, I couldn't even turn. The air pressure behind my shoulder blades spiked. The real god emerged from the fog, and the next thing I knew, a thick spike of glassy obsidian was jutting out of my chest. My back, my spine, my lungs, my heart, and even my soul, the needle's jagged point pierced it all. I looked down at it, blood spraying from my mouth in a violent cough. I don't remember feeling pain. Don't get me wrong, it was painful as fuck. That's the best way I could try and describe what it feels like being staked through your heart. But I just don't remember it. What I do remember is thinking, oh, this is it. The prophecy was fulfilled. As a teeth-clattering chill started seeping into my very bones and darkness began encroaching on the edges of my vision. I had no doubt left that I was going to die now. It was only the question of when. My breath was breaking. It's a suffocating sensation when you physically feel your lungs rapidly filling with blood. But what really gets to you is when you try to inhale as much air as possible, but your breath starts getting shorter and shorter. It feels like drowning, just so much more agonizing. I tried to stay awake, to resist the comfortable embrace of death, but my eyelids felt like lead. At last, I couldn't keep them open. My struggle to stay conscious turned into slow blinks, and with each blink, my awareness started fading into a colorless void. But naturally, I wasn't going to die yet. How would I be telling this story if I were, dead? Okay, yeah, I did die. But not just then, because just then, something miraculous happened. When I forced my eyes open for what I thought would be the final time, I saw something. Before me, the entire battlefield was now half translucent, overlapped by an endless lattice of glowing strings that stretched for as far as the world itself stretched. Glowing strings. Wait. No. Upon a closer look, I realized those strings were made of letters. Yes, small, repetitive sets of letters. They were everywhere, intersecting, overlaying, and weaving into one another in patterns so complex I had to squint to see them. And my brain hurt the more I did. They made up everything, like atoms but on a more conceptual level. Some strings, like the ones knitting together the small glacier under me or the silver sea beyond it, were as thick as chains. Other strings, like those creating the broken shards of ice or the drops of blood on my body, were as thin as spider silk. Yes, by the way, my own body was fabricated from the interconnected weave of those tiny letters as well. Each one of them, those runes, those letters, those codes, shimmered in colors I didn't have names for, in hues that felt wrong to gaze upon. It was as if my eyes were translating something they were never meant to see. Because they indeed were not. I realized a couple of things at that moment. First was that the ice, the fog, the god, and my own impaled body were all just outlines, projections cast by something far more fundamental. The second was that the world had peeled away before my gaze. Peeled, that was the only word that came to mind. Like something had taken reality by the corners and lifted it just a little, enough for me to glimpse what was underneath. Straight away, I was reminded of Rexard's journals and what I had read in those pages. He had mentioned a layer of existence called the underreality. I didn't fully understand what it meant back then. I did now. This was it. This was the foundation atop which the entire physical plane was built, the building block of everything that is. This was the underreality.